Baby Island, Chapter 9, Another Baby. "A goat!" cried Mary. "Goats give milk, and babies shall be fed." Even Jean forgot Prince Charlie's troubles in contemplating the marvel of a goat. "Keep away from them goats, if you please," shouted Mr. Peterkin angrily. But he had spoken too late. Mary never saw a little animal without loving it, and her affection was always returned. She and the little goat were already making friends. 2 other goats followed the first one, and in a moment Mary was surrounded by them and was busy making soft baby talk noises to them and scratching their foreheads between their horns. "It's just here that you scratch them," she said tenderly, "and how they love it." "Oh, look, Mary," said Jean, laying Jonah in the pirate's hammock and hurrying forward. "There's a baby one, too, but there's something wrong with it. Look how thin it is." Indeed, the tiny kid, which wobbled along behind the others, was a pitiful sight. When it came too near the older goats, they turned and pushed it away with their horns. "Why, Mr. Peterkin," cried Mary, "this baby goat is starving." "You telling me?" said Mr. Peterkin crossly. "Don't I know that?" "Well, why don't you do something about it?" asked Mary. "Blimey," shouted Mr. Peterkin. "He won't eat, the little beggar. His ma died last week, and he won't eat nothing. And them big goats, they won't let the little beggar come near him. They won't. Hunnatural, I calls it. Hunnatural." "Have you got a bottle?" asked Mary. "I'll give him it to eat." "Meddlesome young'uns," grumbled Mr. Peterkin. "Meddlesome, I calls 'em." But just the same, he fetched an empty rum bottle and warmed some goat's milk in a pan. Mary made a hole in the cork of the bottle so that a small amount of milk could come through, and when the bottle was filled, she stuck the cork in tightly. "Jonah's bottle would be better," she said, "but Mrs. Snodgrass was always so careful about sterilizing things, I guess she wouldn't want a goat using it." "He won't eat," said Mr. Peterkin pessimistically. "You're wasting your time." But Mary knew better. She took the little goat on her lap, stroking him and talking kindly to him. At first, he turned his head away and refused to take the bottle. But Mary did not give up trying, and when at last she succeeded in getting it into his mouth and he tasted the warm milk, he greedily drank it and bleated for more. "Strike me pink," said Mr. Peterkin in surprise. And for the first time since they had met him, he looked really pleased. "Now," said Mary, when the baby goat had had his fill, "we've come about as far as we can today, Mr. Peterkin, and I'm afraid you'll just have to let us spend the night." "Not if I can help it," cried Mr. Peterkin, a frightened look returning to his face. "Me and Halford and the goats, we live here alone." "We won't be any bother," said Mary. "We have our own food and camping things. If you'll just give us a little milk for the baby's supper, we'll go way up on your beach and not bother you at all." Mr. Peterkin looked very glum. "See here," he said, "my brother Henry, he made a great mistake. He went and got married, he did, to an awful nagging woman he married named Maggie. And they have 12 young'uns, awful meddlesome young'uns. I was promised to be married myself to a lady named Belinda, a fair wench as ever balanced a tray. But, says I, 'twill be Henry and Maggie all over again, says I. So I hups and runs away to this here Highland to be rid of young'uns for the rest of my life. That's why you're not welcome. D'you see?" "Yes, I see," said Mary. "You told us that before. You are very, very much mistaken about young ones, Mr. Peterkin. If you knew us better, I'm sure that you would like us. But we promised to go away first thing in the morning. Now, please do be a good man and give us some goat's milk for supper, and we won't bother you one bit." Grumbling a great deal, Mr. Peterkin filled their pail half full of goat's milk. "My, you certainly have a lot," said Jean admiringly. "What do you do with all of it?" "Cheese," said Mr. Peterkin glumly. "But you surely can't eat so much cheese all by yourself, can you?" "Questions, questions, questions," grumbled the honest seaman. And at a sign from Mary, Jean wisely held her tongue. The pram made a very good bed with the blanket spread over it, and it was quite pleasant sleeping once again under the bright stars. They made a campfire and roasted bananas and steamed clams, which smelled very good in the clear night air and tasted even better. And the babies smacked their lips over the fresh goat's milk. The baby goat had gone with them to their camp and followed Mary's every move, bleating piteously. This seemed to anger Mr. Peterkin still more, and he came down and got it and shut it roughly into his goat pen. "My goodness," said Jean, "I almost believe I'd rather have found a pirate or a savage than that old crosspatch." Oh, no, Jean, said Mary. I feel so sorry for him. Not to like babies? Think what he's missing. Besides, if he had been a savage, he might have eaten us, and a pirate might have made us walk the plank. Mr. Peterkin just wants us to go away, and then he owns goats. Somehow, Jean, we've got to persuade him to let us have milk. But how? Asked Jean. He's about as sociable as a sour oyster. We'll have to work on his better feelings, of course. Do you think he has any? Oh, Jean, everybody has better feelings if you can just get at them. I think Mr. Peterkin's are pretty far under, said Jean gloomily. You leave him to me, said Mary. They were awakened in the morning by the hoarse voice singing, Oh, Belinda, I'd like to steal ya. Halfred, the parrot, had come over to inspect the camp. He walked around and around them while Jean held the chattering Charlie safely in her arms. Good morning, Halfred, said Mary politely. I hope that you had a good night. Oh, you would you? Oh, you would you? Said Halfred sarcastically. Mary held out a small piece of hardtack. Halfred took it in one claw and, standing one-legged, nibbled it daintily, cocking his yellow eye at them all the while. Well, bless my soul, he remarked. Well, bless my soul and body. Mary held out another piece of hardtack. Oh, you would you? Said Halfred. But this time his tone has lost its sarcasm and was quite ingratiating. Presently he was like one of the family, letting the twins pet him and call him Bertie, and Mary scratched his head and smoothed his tail feathers, for Mary knew the right place to scratch a parrot's head, too. In the midst of this pleasant domestic scene, Mr. Peterkin arrived like a thundercloud. Halfred, come out of there, he commanded sternly. Halfred flew obediently to his master's shoulder, tweaking his ears and remarking hoarsely, Man the pumps, Captain, man the pumps. Look 'ere, said Mr. Peterkin, addressing Mary. That kid's sick again. He won't eat nohow. I give him the bottle just like you did, and blimey, if he don't shun me cold. Well, said Mary, of course he won't take a bottle if you're cross with him. You have to make yourself look and sound like his mother. Me? Roared Mr. Peterkin. Me look and sound like a nanny goat? That's what I said. Look 'ere, miss, you come and give him the bottle. I'll give you milk for your youngin's breakfast, if you'll get the little beggar to take his. Mary wanted nothing better. Here, you hold these babies for me, she said, putting Jonah and Aunt Elizabeth into the astonished seaman's arms, and she ran off to the goat pen. Jean followed her, holding the twins by the hand, with Halfred and Charlie hopping along on each side. Last of all came the dazed Mr. Peterkin, carrying two babies, and gingerly as if they had smallpox. Aunt Elizabeth gave Mr. Peterkin a long look, and then her face dimpled into a lovely baby smile. Pity, said Aunt Elizabeth, touching his fierce black whiskers. Pity, pity. Mr. Peterkin was embarrassed, but he was also just a little flattered. Nobody had ever before called his beard pretty. It took Mary only a moment to persuade the baby goat to take his breakfast. All he wanted was a kind hand and a gentle voice to administer it. And when he had finished it, Mary turned to Mr. Peterkin. Now, I'll show you how to get his confidence, she said. And in a moment, the haughty Mr. Peterkin was taking lessons on the art of looking and sounding like a mamma nanny goat. Well, blow me down, he remarked hoarsely when Mary told him that he had done well at his lessons. Meanwhile, inquisitive Jean and the twins were exploring Mr. Peterkin's shanty. Oh, Mary, cried Jean from the shanty, he's got a phonograph. As it happened, the phonograph was Mr. Peterkin's greatest weakness, and now he couldn't resist showing it off. Making a great pretense of grumbling, he went into the shanty and wound it up. It was an old-fashioned affair with large horns shaped like a purple morning glory. The records were all black wax cylinders. With a certain amount of pride and condescension, Mr. Peterkin played 2 records for them, In the Shade of the Old Apple Tree and Oh, Belinda. Halfred, perching himself upon the horn, sang the choruses. He was quite off-key and about a measure behind, but nobody minded that. So that's where he learned it, said Mary, and nearly scared Jean to death. That Jean and the babies were delighted, but soon tidy Mary could see nothing but gaze about in the awful disarray of Mr. Peterkin's one room. Oh, Mr. Peterkin, she said, what a dreadful mess. I'm not an housekeeper, miss, he said apologetically. I should say not. Oh, but it's a lovely mess, Mary, cried Jean, with the phonograph and Pharaoh's horses in that great gold picture frame and shells and ship models and the iron stove and that great brass-bound chest. What's in that, Mr. Peterkin?" "I say you leave that chest alone, you hear?" said Mr. Peterkin, and was angry again, and Jean retreated rapidly. "You're not going to touch that, never, you hear?" "But his bed's not made," said Mary, unable to think of anything else, "and the dust is terrible." "Well, I hates housework," cried Mr. Peterkin crossly. "'Tis the only hardship of living by myself. Cooking is awful too, but a man's got to live on, even on a desert highland." Suddenly, Mary's eyes grew starry with an idea. "Look here," she said. "If one of us came over every week and cleaned your house and cooked up some food for you, would you give us milk for the babies? Would you?" He scratched his head. "You bother me," he growled. "No, we promise not to bother. We cross our hearts, won't we, Jean?" Solemnly, they crossed their hearts. "Women," snorted Mr. Peterkin. "Babies. I thought I'd escaped them." "Oh, come, said Mary sensibly. "You're being awfully silly, you know. We won't hurt you at all, and we're offering to take all your troublesome housework off your hands. Think how nice it would be to have a tidy cabin and some well-cooked food while you go out hunting or lie on your hammock, and all we ask is a little milk for the babies. You have a lot more milk than you need yourself." Mr. Peterkin looked at her and scratched his head. He looked at Jean and at each of the babies. When he looked at Aunt Elizabeth, she burst into smiles and said, "Pity, pity." Mr. Peterkin actually blushed. Then he turned to Halfred. "What say, Halfred?" he said doubtfully. Halfred flew onto his shoulder and tweaked his ear. "Man the pumps, Captain, man the pumps," he remarked genially. "Well," said Mr. Peterkin, "we'll give her a try. But you behave yourself. That's all I say. Behave yourself, and never, for no reason, look into that chest of mine."